Now, Stuart, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Stuart Gillespie, who has 4 decades of experience in food, nutrition, and health policy and research. That's quite a accolade you have there, Stuart. After acquiring your PhD in human nutrition from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Stuart spent 4 years with the World Health Organization in Geneva and then 2 years with UNICEF in India. He's then spent subsequent time as a freelance consultant. Stuart has then spent an extensive period of time at the International Food Policy Research Institute, where over several years he led a number of initiatives, including a consortium on the double burden of malnutrition, as well as the flagship agricultural program for nutrition and health. Stuart has over 200 publications, including 10 books, and today's presentation, as I mentioned earlier, really draws upon Stuart's most recent book. And we're so excited to hear about your insights and really shining a light on the evolution of the current global food system and how it's really become dominated by a handful of very powerful transnational companies. I really am excited and somewhat you're reassured, Stuart, that at the end you'll be leaving us with hope and drawing upon evidence from around the world about how we can collectively pull things together. So thank you very much, Stuart, and over to you.
Thank you, Christina, and thank you for the opportunity. The book is, as well, it's the same title, but that's what it looks like. If you're in Canada, you have an exploding tomato as a cover. So that came out a month ago. What I want to do, and I'll just try and take 30 minutes to ensure we have time for Q&A, is to firstly, very briefly, update ourselves on the nature of the challenge that we have in front of us with regard to malnutrition and food injustice, manifestations, and then a brief history of how we got to where we are now, before digging into sort of a deeper diagnosis of some of the structural drivers of the challenge, and then finally and importantly, the solutions or potential solutions and what we can learn from various countries around the world. That's the plan. So this is a slide showing 3 faces of child malnutrition. When I first started working in nutrition way back in the 80s, I really only looked at issues around child undernutrition. Was engaged in work on stunting and wasting. Child overweight just really didn't exist. It wasn't visible. It certainly wasn't on the public health radar. It's changed a lot since. If we look more broadly in the context of everyone, all individuals, adults as well as children and young adults, we see these kind of data which are really quite shocking. We have effectively a kind of a pandemic situation with regard to overweight and obesity, in as much as the rates or the prevalence has tripled in just over 30 years for adults. It's 2.5 times in a similar period for children. It's multiplied 2.5 times for children and young adults. This is obviously unprecedented, where recent data was released and highlighted in The Guardian this week, showing that in several districts or councils in the UK, within just 10 years, more than 50% of all 10 to 11-year-olds will be the majority will be overweight and obese. So it's a big deal, big problem, and this is not just in this country, it's around the world, or growing. This particular graph I'm showing here is from the last 40 years of the last century in the US, across both women and men, across different age groups, different demographics, and it's showing something starting to happen dramatically around the mid-late 70s. Which is the point at which I want to talk about the very brief history. I'm not going to go right back into colonial times, which is when capitalism developed its kind of business model. But what we need to understand and realize is that this has been a dramatically shifting landscape with regard to food, nutrition, and health. And the big problem is a simple fact that the food system we have now, the predominant global food system we have, is destroying more than it produces, and that's been shown by the Food Systems Economic Commission, and it's been costed at around $15 trillion per year, which is 12% of GDP. And And that's largely because we have a food system that was designed in a different century for a different purpose. It was really started to be, it was built after the Second World War to mass produce cheap calories, to prevent famine, and over time and through the Green Revolution, technologies going online, it began to be used also through food aid, a strategic use of food aid to buffer the West from the spread of communism. And over the last 50 years or so of neoliberalism, again, from around the period where you see this graph take off, food has been increasingly viewed less and less as a basic need or a human right, and more as a commodity. The system has become heavily financialized, and it has been, and there's a lot of data which I'll briefly show you, it has been captured right across the board from production to consumption. Different companies, a small handful of large transnational corporations have control and massive amounts of economic, financial, political and epistemic power, which we'll get to. So we have a system that is being driven by profit. It's not being driven by the need to nourish people and planet, and that's the crux of the challenge. We do not see a system in which really grows a lot of whole foods. It tends to grow raw ingredients for industrial processes, and it grows cattle feed, and there are some biofuels, and there are some whole foods. So that's the crux of the challenge we have, and that's why I believe we do need a radical overhaul of the food system. I'm obviously not the only one who's saying that, but we'll come to what that might actually mean and what kind of experience we see around the world to help us in that, turning that around. So, you know, this is a headline from The Guardian from November of last year. Addiction to junk food costing, this is work done by the Food, Farming, Countryside Commission, 268 billion a year, an astronomical amount. 2/3 of this figure are costs that fall on individuals and households in terms of ill health, premature mortality, lost productivity. You know, there's been an epidemic of sick days due to ill health. A lot of that is driven by diet-related chronic disease. The other third, it falls directly on the NHS. It falls on welfare and social services. This dwarfs, well, it doesn't dwarf, but it's significantly larger amount than the entire budget for the NHS. Now, what you, assuming there's not much of a lag, you will see a lot of companies here on this map. And there are many ways of depicting the food system, and you've seen many of them, I'm sure, already. I'm going to show this. This is actually taken from several years ago. Originally, Oxfam used it. But in the center there, you see about 10 brands. These are very large transnational corporations. They own many other companies, and some of those other companies also own other companies. So there's a series of kind of Russian dolls. That's effectively one illustration of corporate capture. We can also see that, as I say, across the board, there are different companies that have captured markets and from right up the producer level of agribusiness in terms of global grain trade, these 4 companies here having up to 90% of the market. Down on the retail side, we have Nestle, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, General Mills, and Unilever around 75%. Control of markets, financial and economic markets in terms of the foods sold. We have in this country, in the UK, 4 supermarkets, Tesco, Sainsbury's, Morrison's, and Asda, that control 70% of store-bought food products. That's another clear illustration of capture. And we see again, we see this is a graph that shows, for again timeline, showing the upswing in ultra-processed food manufacture significantly started to kick in around about the late 70s. And now it's generating $3 billion per day of sales, again, driven largely by, so the blue is the UPFs in this graph, driven largely by these 10 corporations. Carlos Montero is a name that you're probably familiar with. Carlos is a friend of mine. I worked with him back in the 90s in Geneva when he was involved in a series of case studies that showed success across the world in driving down rates of child stunting. And he did a great study. I was coordinating it for those 10 countries. He did a great study in Brazil. And then afterwards, he sort of was talking in conversations. We said, well, he said there's something else is happening, and I'm not happy with the way things are happening so quickly, and the food environments are changing so quickly in Brazil. 10 years down the line, he started looking at the strange picture with regard to dietary surveys that seemed to be showing that there wasn't a big change in levels of salt, saturated fat, sugar, but levels of child obesity and overweight were starting to rise. What was changing was the degree of processing and the ultra processing of products that were flooding in from North America. So he hypothesized there was something else beyond high fat, saturated fats, and sugar. There was something else that was relating to ultra processing that was driving harms in as much or manifesting as child obesity. He designed a classification system. He said, as a scientist, you need to have a system to understand how to classify foods to be able to understand which ones are causing harms. The NOVA system, you're probably, many of you will be aware of, most of you will be aware of. I'm not going to go through the NOVA. There are 4 categories. There are 3 here. Natural, which is NOVA 1. NOVA 2 is basic culinary ingredients. NOVA 3 category are the processed foods, and NOVA 4 ultra processed foods. So what you see, if you take these 3 foodstuffs, tomatoes, raspberries, and chicken, you see changes going from left to right with regard to the numbers of ingredients, with regards to what they look like, less and less like foods. And the ultra processed foods have are designed deliberately for overconsumption. They are hyperpalatable. They have been looked at with regard to their addictive potential. They are ready to eat anywhere, anytime, high energy density, high fat, salt, sugar, low fiber, low in terms of concentration of various micronutrients. This is all deliberately designed to maximize sales, to displace other foods, and to enable companies to generate a myriad of variants around these types of products. And a whole new vocabulary, as shown here, has grown up around UPFs. And they are not good for us, most of them. Not every single one of the foodstuffs is harmful necessarily, but in the aggregate and across diets, as we see now, the increasing proportions of diets that are driven by UPFs, they're harmful. They're harmful for us, our health. They're harmful for the planet. I haven't got time to go into all the various studies, but there are many studies now showing strong associations with regard to obesity, especially obesity, cardiovascular disease, mental ill health, and premature mortality. A very famous study by Kevin Hall looked into this in terms of using a randomized controlled trial and showed that indeed ultra processing conferred an extra degree of harm on top of the changes in terms of nutrient content, to the extent that people on purely eating UPFs over a 2-week period would put on an extra or ingest an extra 500 calories a day and put on an extra 1 kilo every 2 weeks. And again, this study is well known. It's a 2019 study. Environmental impacts are huge as well, and we do know that the food system generates nearly a third of all greenhouse gas emissions. London Climate Action Week just kicked off yesterday. I was in a great session on climate change and health. Big issue. Most of those gas emissions are driven by the UPF industry. We see effects on energy use, biodiversity loss, land use, food waste, air pollution, water pollution, and obviously and importantly, plastic pollution, which is a big deal. And why is this important? The reason it's important is because it's so ubiquitous in terms of the share of the diet, in calorie share of the diet that is driven by UPFs. And here's an example across various countries. We are not doing at all well towards the right of this bar chart. And we can look at it that way. We can also look at what the big 4 or sorry, the big food companies are actually producing, what their portfolios look like. They are not healthy. This is work that's, this chart shows the red is the unhealthy percentage of the portfolio of these various companies listed out on the left here. I'm rushing through a little bit because I want to get to the solutions. Right, junk food swamps. This, again, is a way of looking at food environments in neighborhoods, and there are various ways of doing that. In this case, I think this was in, maybe it was Toronto, looking at the shares of healthy food establishments compared to total food establishments. Wherever you see red here, the red shading, it's just 1 in 6. Only 1 in 6 of all food establishments were considered to be healthy. And then we look at marketing. So there's market power, there's financial power, and that power is used to drive even more consumption and to reach ever further out into various countries, into various areas. We see a 7-fold difference overall in general around unhealthy food marketing to children compared to healthy food marketing. Nestle's marketing budget, around $19 billion, is 5 times the WHO's operating budget. It's probably more now since WHO have had its cuts. So it's just obscene, the differential with regard to marketing and our ability to deal with the consequences. That further speaks to that. This is recent work also from the Food Foundation here in the UK. And then, what we have is a system which has a certain logic. The logic is to maximize profit, and therefore innovation is driven by the logic of the system. Innovation is all about technological innovation to maximize profit, which manifests in a whole series of products that are not that different, but they look different. And here's another example from PepsiCo. I couldn't believe this. This looks like antifreeze. I saw this recently in Waitrose. The other side of this, part of this story, is that these were on pallets right by checkouts. They're not on the aisles. They weren't allowed to be put on the aisles. They made special pallets so that you almost fell over these bottles of a strange blue liquid before you could get to the checkout. They disappeared a few weeks later. I don't know what happened to them, but that's an example of a system-driven innovation, which is obviously not good for us. And this is part of the corporate vision. This is a quote. I borrowed this from Phil Baker's recent presentation. And you can read it. You can see, this was from a long time ago when the head of Coca-Cola spoke of wanting to take over from water. And there's the horrifying stories of how that actually manifested in Mexico when Vicente Fox, this is a revolving door from industry into government, when Vicente Fox became president in 2000 and was for 6 years, brought in a lot of his pals from Coca-Cola, where he was the CEO. And that's when obesity took off in Mexico. Diabetes, 1 in 6 had diabetes. 40,000 deaths every year were related to overconsumption of sugary drinks. And we see now the markets spreading out across different parts of the world, different countries, different regions in different countries. I never used to, on the left there, you see, and this is a photo taken by Anna Herforth in Lilongwe a couple of years ago. I never used to see anything like this, those kind of billboards in Malawi when I worked there in the 2010s even. And I think, there's not much regulation happening in Africa, and that's why big food is moving in quite massively at the moment. Right. I'm going to talk about the ways in which market and financial power is translated into political power. And that can be shown in 5 deadly Ds as I talk about it. And there's a chapter in my book which became so big, it was called The Dark Arts, because the more I looked at this, the more I found. But in summary, we'll go through these 5 Ds. First is to shed doubt or sow doubt on any evidence of harms of products. And that is very much the corporate playbook that has come from tobacco. There's a lot of disputing of evidence. There is a significant problem of conflict of interest, whereby industry pays scientists to do various studies which in the aggregate generate significant and systematic bias towards industry, hardly surprising. We see problems of conflict of interest with regard to dietary advisory committees, advising governments. Second D, distortion. Now, the distortion, sorry, let's do that this way around. Yes. So that's the first part in terms of conflict of interest. And we see conflicts in terms of sponsorship of conferences. I think we need to have clear guidelines, and there are, and they're being developed to avoid any infiltration from big food in many of these conferences. What they do confer bias, they do represent a big part of the problem. Distortion. There's a great report came out with the Food Foundation. I was involved in some work that led to this. There was an amazing statistic that in the period of 2020 to 2025, there were just 35 meetings between government officials and public interest NGOs, but there were 1,300 meetings between government professionals and big food and trade associations. There's a 40-fold difference in meetings. And the second part of that problem is that we often don't know what was done or what was spoken about or what was decided in those meetings because the disclosure protocols are just not being followed properly. Third is distraction. Now, I can illustrate this by, if a company is a person, it has two hands. If your left hand, you want to be visible, doing good work, doing small scale boutique projects that are beneficial for nutrition, and you will make sure the media understands and sees those, and you will do a lot of promotional work with the left hand on all those good projects you're doing. Whereas the right hand is a large scale business model which continues to drive harm. And we constantly see this distraction, and it's, we've had words, it's a language of corporate laundry, greenwashing, sports washing, blue washing, pink washing. This is a big part of the problem, and we, I think, need to call it out. There's another aspect that's grown up in recent times, and this came out also of the UN Food Systems Summit, wherein various large companies like PepsiCo, who are implicated in driving higher levels of obesity through their various products and practices, fund child hunger initiatives, undernutrition initiatives. So, in a way, this is nutri-washing. It's using one side, a company funding one side of the problem while hoping to get away with what it is doing in driving the other side of the problem, which again is a big part of our challenge. Disguise, beware of Trojan horses. There are many trade associations. I mean, there are actually hundreds. I mean, there was a fantastic piece of work done by Ben Woods to show how companies, and especially the big transnational companies, effectively kind of hide behind these trade associations. And it's the trade associations and bodies like the World Business Council on Sustainable Development is one that get to go to conferences and get to give the food industry line and get close to the policy table. I think we need to be aware of that and shine a light. I don't understand how any group that has Philip Morris International, Nestle, McDonald's, and Coca-Cola should be sitting around designing nutrition policy. And then third, I don't have time to go into all the dodge part of this. A lot of it is about tax dodging. There's avoidance and evasion. One is legal, one is illegal. But ultimately, it's about maximizing profits. When you get companies as big as they are, they can move their tax liabilities around the world. So what our governments are doing? Well, the problem we've had over 14 years in this country, until recently, is a government that didn't want to do anything because partly it was spooked by this notion of nanny state. Boris Johnson had a strange idea that he shouldn't ever, or government shouldn't ever protect public health. If you look at the list of various policies and policy instruments on this list, every one of these is a government decision to protect public health by changing something that's large scale in an environment for which they have a responsibility to act on. Junk food, ultra-processed food kills more than any of these on this list. So there's a clear need to ditch that nonsense argument about non-interference because of nanny state. And there was a great, a lot of you will know about this, a great series of consultations and discussions led to this House of Lords committee report, Recipe for Health, a plan to fix our broken food system. The problem then was the government really didn't do much. First of all, it delayed responding to that particular report. When it did respond, it basically said, oh, don't worry, we'll get to it eventually. And cans were being kicked down the road, and it's still happening recently with regard to delays. And this is a video of Baroness Walmsley ripping up the government response to her report. So transformation, and this is solutions bit. Let's see how we're doing for time. Yeah, I've got another few slides. I think we have to be clear that we don't have a broken food system. The system is fit for purpose. It's just fit for the wrong purpose. And the purpose was always and has been, because of those who control it, to maximize profit. What we need is a different system. I don't think we can think in terms of incremental changes, piecemeal changes, ad hoc. It has to be systemic. It has to be structural. And so we have to think in terms of a real serious transformation. That's an elephant, hawk moth, caterpillar on the left that has transformed into an extraordinarily different creature on the right. It looks different, has different function, and has a different purpose. And I think there are ways that needs to be driven, and I believe in pressing all the buttons and pulling all the levers. But fundamentally, government has to stand up and set the guardrails, the rules, the parameters within which the food system operates. It's also, I think, through a kind of top-down, bottom-up pressure, important for citizens to ensure that governments do that. So what can governments do? 4 ins, briefly: institutions, incentives, information, interests. The first, institutions, is through procuring healthy foods and restricting UPFs for schools, agencies, hospitals, clinics, which the government has in terms of public procurement, which the government has a mandate for. There's a story in my book. I haven't got time to go into it. Wonderful and inspirational young woman while we were in Najuru in Kenya, and what she did with regard to school feeding, which the government then collaborated with, and they're scaling up school meals across the entire country of Kenya in the next 5 years. That's institutions, public procurement. Second, incentives. And here it's essentially about using taxes to downregulate and removing anachronistic subsidies, which we haven't really had time to talk about, to upstream subsidies, using those taxes and reforms of subsidies to downregulate unhealthy aspects of the food system, but importantly to earmark and to channel a dividends from those taxes and those revenues, channel that towards upregulating the healthy via subsidies or other means of improving the access and affordability of healthy foods for low-income families. And we've seen what's happening across the world, over 120 countries, that sugary drinks taxes, they do work. They in different ways. There's always room for improvement, but by and large, they are successful and have been. We see and beginning to see, Colombia was the first from November of 2023 to introduce a junk food tax. And that'll be interesting to see how that is rolled out over time. The third is information. And here it's all about regulating labeling, advertising, marketing, commercial promotion of UPFs. Great experience in Colombia and Mexico with regard to the black octagons, whereby a label is slapped onto a packet of whatever foodstuff or product when certain thresholds are breached with regard to sugar, salt, energy density, and saturated fats. And once those octagons get put on, cartoon characters have to be taken off, like Tony the Tiger on the Frosties packet. That's information. And then there's obviously other aspects of information around dietary guidelines used for policy. And importantly, interests. The fourth in, I think, is interest. And here we need to rid our advisory bodies and dietary guideline committees of conflicts of interest. We have to clean up lobbying. There's a story around that headline there from over 40 years ago, the cover-up that kills. I won't go into detail. I haven't got time to talk about that. But this is a long-standing issue with regard to conflicts of interest across our food regulatory bodies. And poor lobbying disclosure practices. And then there's a nuclear option. If this doesn't work, then government has the power, needs to operate, if you like, a nuclear option to disperse, democratize, and dissolve corporations that don't adhere to these kind of new guardrails. I have a chapter called "A Tale of Four Cities," where I shine a light on various what cities are doing, because there's an amazing set of innovations, social innovations, that are being enacted in various cities around the world. Birmingham is an interesting case study. I did some work with them with the Food Foundation in Birmingham. And just on cities, also in the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact is doing great work across the world. Citizens and civil society have the ability and the agency to do various things to drive change and to drive food systems transformation. Expose, oppose harmful products and practices, use evidence and experience to educate the public, advocate for stronger governmental action, and also shine a light, and NGOs shine a light and monitor what corporations are doing, what governments are doing, and hold industry and government to account. But importantly, beyond organizations or individuals acting to mobilize and to build social movements, I think there's a lot we can learn from looking at social movements in other areas, from the HIV era, from political change, through suffragette movements, through campaign for the minimum wage, climate action. There's a lot we can learn from these movements. This is something that came out of the Bite Back 2030 youth group movement. And again, youth is such a powerful force across change, and they're doing some great work. That's just one example of a report they brought out. So just to conclude, I think everyone, all of us has a role in this, really. We do need to demand our government step up and act to protect public health, especially for those who are least able to protect their own health, low-income, marginalized populations and groups. Civil society, citizens, cities, food industry. Food industry will follow, and I think we may see the innovation being driven more about through social purpose, through the social purpose rather than pure profit. Media, we really need media to tell the better stories. Stories both in terms of the challenges, but importantly in terms of the solutions. Research and academia, I think we need more work on the commercial determinants, more work on the political economy of nutrition. I am going to close with this last. So the last part of the last chapter of the book just highlights what I think are some core key principles for change, for reaching this food future. As mentioned, it's a shared responsibility for all of us. We do need to raise the primacy and the visibility of the human rights rationale for action, the ethical imperative. And a large part of this has to be around knowledge sharing and experience. Knowledge sharing and learning. A lot about experience, not just about evidence. Diversity, plurality. We have to be systemic and structural and comprehensive across the board. I think a really great way of framing this as well is around children and even unborn children. So future generations, what is the world that they're going to be being born into? And I think actually we need to reclaim this word freedom. Freedom has tended to be used by libertarians to say, don't do regulation because there has to be freedom to choose. But the reality is there's not a freedom to choose a healthy diet on the part of those least capable, low-income families, marginalized groups. So we need to reclaim that word and put it in its proper place. So I will leave it there. I think I have gone over time. That's what I'm also on Substack. So I do a Food Fight Files follow-up if anyone's interested in logging into Substack as well. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I think I may have gone over time slightly.
Not at all. That was excellent. Thank you very much, Stuart. And we've got questions streaming in.
Oh, dear.
There's so much richness in what you've presented, bringing in new elements that, to what we may have been aware of before. I think particularly some of the big statistics are really very interesting. The marketing statistics, the profit statistics of these big multinational corporations who really do dominate our food system. We've got a couple of questions. I'm going to start with a tricky-ish one, if that's okay. That's a bit of a combination of my own and one from Anthony So. We talk about food being a commodity. Now, do we really believe that there's any potential for food not to be a commodity and that it is there as a social good? And Anthony sort of talks about, our marker of success as a society is still GDP and growth, economic growth. And Anthony says, you mentioned that food firms make $3 billion of sales daily. So what really is so my question is it possible to sort of move from food not being a commodity? And then secondly, Anthony is saying, what is the specific amount of financial profit that you believe is acceptable for food industry to make?
Um, well, that's the second one's a hard question. I mean, the first part, yeah, it may be a commodity, but why would we want to agree with the notion of a commodity that is harmful because of the way it's designed and the purpose? I think we can accept that there will be things. We're not going to kill capitalism. There will be things that can be considered to be commodities, but there's no reason why they can't be healthy. So I think it's about the problem is that there's this system has been driven by adding so-called value, but the value really is more steps in processing, which generates more profit, and may end up increasing shelf lives and portability of foods across. So I don't even see how we can continue into another 20 years with a system like this and hope to make any inroads beyond. We haven't talked about GLP-1 weight loss medications, but is that the future we want? And I can't answer the question about what's an acceptable level of profit. The point about profits, if profit is reinvested into something useful, and not just driven by the other part that I didn't get to, is a large part of the problem relates to pension fund holders, asset management firms, hedge funds like Vanguard, BlackRock, State Street, who are buying up increasing amount of shares of the big food companies to just drive and maximize profit at all costs, regardless. And so then it's the most profitable products, which, as I say, as we know, tend to be ultra processed. That has to be. So I think we have, as citizens, have a responsibility to ask questions about where are our pension funds and which companies and which corporations are holding those, and how's our money being invested. Profits could be reinvested in useful ways, but I don't know about numbers. The entire system is skewed towards, as I say, a handful which are not operating in ways that are good for people and planet. So I think we need to be pushing that in a different direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's two things I'd add to that is like the commodity at the moment, the commodity is calories and profit, as you say, economics and calories. There's no nutritional quality there. So surely for some social goods like energy, like water, like food, we can add a caveat around, and for us, it's nutritional quality or nutritional density, which isn't there at all at the moment. I think the other thing is around profit. It's distribution of profit, isn't it? And also that fairness across within companies of that distribution of profit, which is not fair at all. It's very heavily stacked in all these multinational companies in food and any other, commodity or organization that you're talking about. So we've got a couple of questions about UPFs. Surprise, surprise. There's an anonymous attendee has asked, is it possible for you to provide a source about the environmental impacts of UPF?
Yeah. I don't have it right now, but if he or she would like to, I mean, there's a whole section in the book with source references and citations. I can't, off the top of my head, tell you a key source or several. Kim Anastasio is one person I do know has worked on environmental effects of UPFs. But there's multiple studies looking at plastic pollution, because obviously UPFs tend to be wrapped in plastic. We have a situation where McDonald's alone generates 1 billion kilos of plastic every year, which is the weight of 200 Eiffel Towers. We find that plastic is in many of our brains, most organs in our bodies. Micro nanoplastics are actually reducing yields in crops now due to the way they've infiltrated, sort of become leached into soils over time. They're beginning to discover these kind of impacts. Yeah, there's loads of stuff. There's loads of evidence on that, but there's no one single study.
Great. And Alicia Weston sort of has another UPF comment. She says, I note that you're keen on subsidizing fruit and veg. Yay. But what do you really think about taxing UPFs? There's a lot of talk about this, and it's very regressive, particularly as it's the poorest people who eat the most UPFs, about
Right.
78% of their diet in the UK. So she is concerned, and what are they supposed to eat if we raise the price of their everyday food, even if we
That
shouldn't be eating it?
That's a great question. That's exactly why I showed that seesaw. I am against taxing anything that when people have no alternatives. So the point about that is to do both things. You actually raise the floor, the ability of especially poor families to access and afford healthy diets. Um, at the same time or before even, the taxation revenues kick in from taxing harms. And it's like a reflexive response often that you can't touch UPS because people who are poor eat them, and I think we have to do a lot better than that. And there are examples across the world where that is beginning to be tried out, and the cities, so to some extent. So I think that's something that we have to be creative about that. We have to find ways of ensuring that these things can be done. It's about a proper, if you like, a social protection mechanism that may involve vouchers, subsidies, different ways. There's a lot of experience in social protection, and if we can work through ways of ensuring that tax dividend is used and not funneled into, I don't know, defense spending. That's the approach to be taken. But the approach to be taken is not to say we can't touch these food products.
Yeah, completely agree. I completely agree with that coupling approach, both within
Yeah,
regulations and, between regulations, where we're boosting fruit and veg, particularly, and, subsidies into horticulture.
yeah,
So we're doing both agriculture and
yeah.
consumers. Yeah, completely agree. Thank you very much. Seema Hamida says, great talk, Stuart. I have a question for you. I believe technology plays a big role in manipulating and or adjusting the food systems globally. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, technology, sure. But again, part of the system. So the question is, what's the system? What's the purpose? We can use technology. So let's talk about innovation. Innovation literally means something new, or it's something repurposed that can be used in different ways. In the pharmaceutical industry, maybe a drug that's found that actually this is how GLP agonists were repurposed, and they were meant to be Ozempic was meant to be a diabetes drug in it, and they realized that there were weight loss effects. So innovations have been driven by the system, and the system is driven by the need to maximize profit. So we have a default to more technological approaches which are aligned with that. Technologies can be part of social innovations too. But I think again, it's about what's the purpose. The purpose is to improve the health of our population, but also the planet. The other part of this that I find amazing when, for example, in this country, Keir Starmer talks about economic growth. Economic growth. We won't touch big business because we don't want to get in their way. And then you see headlines like 268 billion pounds a year due to our terrible diet.
Yeah.
I think so. I'm going off tack a bit, but I mean, technology has a role, but I think again, we have to start having a big conversation about our food environments and the need for change, and the role of technology will come through once we have that conversation, but also we reset our purpose.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's so true. And, go back to whole foods. That's what's so lovely about the Nova classification. It's a reminder about minimally
Yeah.
processed forming the bulk of our diet. David Finlay says you focused your talk on the people elements of your book, but systems change should also encompass the just transition of our method of food production to address environmental and welfare challenges. What are your comments on this?
Yeah, that's a fair comment. To be fair to myself, I mean, or at least to own up to the fact that I have tended to, in my book as well, to focus more on the people side and the health side of humans. Um, and I'm actually I was in London at the Climate Action Week on climate and health yesterday. Fantastic days, discussions, finish with Mary Robinson giving a very inspirational talk about hope in the future. And a large part of that was because that's about land use, it's about upstream food production environment. Yeah, I haven't. I do have a chapter on carbon and plastic. It's called Carbon and Plastic, where I dig into the two-way interactions between the food system in terms of driving a set of problems with regard to climate, greenhouse gas emissions, and pollution, but also the way in which climate is disproportionately affecting marginalized populations who already are food insecure or vulnerable. So you have this two-way vicious cycle effect. And invariably, the people hit hardest are those least able. First of all, the people least responsible for generating those kind of emissions. One adult in sub-Sahara has the greenhouse gas emissions less than an American fridge.
Wow.
So it's completely unfair, inequitable, and yeah, and there's a whole chapter on equity as well. But yeah, no, that's a fair thing. That would have been the next book.
Yeah, though, I mean, I think the point being that that middle section of the food system is where the corporate consolidation is, which is actually meaning that we're disadvantaging, or making it harder for consumers and harder
Yeah,
for, agriculture and production. So that seems
yeah.
to be the point. Related to that, then, what are the key methods for breaking down corporate consolidation? Like you offered that as one of the options. So how do we build SMEs and how do we realistically break down that consolidation, which seems to be infiltrated in every practice? It's personal relationships, it's people from school, from college, from university, it's, people that they've worked with, so much of it is infiltrated into relationships, which feels hard for us what role do we have in sort of really
Well,
effectively breaking down corporate consolidation?
right. Yeah. I mean, I think governments have to start, as I say, setting the guardrails. But I mentioned that nuclear option. We need to have a democratization of boards of corporations, and that has to be legalized. Antitrust, anti-competition law needs to be followed through. It's beginning to happen with regard to things like Google and others. It used to happen with Microsoft. That we need to take that seriously with regard to some of these massive corporations. And then if those don't work, there is always the dissolution, full revocation of privileges to trade. But there's a stepwise set of potential actions, and the power to enact those policy changes rests with governments. Until now, in many cases, we've had governments that sit on the sidelines and don't get in the way. It's unconscionable that will continue. But yeah, I won't go beyond that. But I think there are steps that can be taken, and then each time that happens, we see responses and we adjust.
Yeah, great. Alexia Meller says, I'm a canine nutrition consultant, and I'm concerned about how the same corporatization of the food system is driving the pet food industry and the resultant health problems that we see in companion animals that echo what we're seeing in humans. Do you see potential for a joined up interspecies approach to redesigning a food system that supports nutrition justice for humans and companion animals alike?
Yeah, well, that's interesting. I haven't really, to be honest, I haven't thought a lot about it, but why not? No, I mean, these are universal principles, and we have different species. We are one of them, and I absolutely there's a whole ethical conversation that needs to happen about animals in our food system that I haven't even touched on. I went to the fantastic Oxford Literary Festival with two great speakers, David Clough and Shireen Kassam, talking about animal welfare and the appalling, treatment of livestock and poultry around the world in this food system we have. And it's absolutely and completely unethical. And we tend to turn away and look the other way. We may actually become vegetarian or vegan, but a lot more has to be done. And I think the rights of species, the interspecies solidarity has to have a place, and so why not? We yeah. So I would say yes. There's no we should be learning wherever we have this kind of corporate capture that's driving harm. It needs to be addressed.
Yeah, and I agree with you wholeheartedly, Lisa. I provide a whole food diet for my dogs,
All right.
rather than any kind of kibble or yeah, he doesn't get given any of that. So I read a book, Give a Dog a Bone, a long time ago, and it was a good book, basically saying exactly that. Anne-Marie Mayer says, would you like to comment on the issue of single nutrient solutions that feed into food industry through fortification, agricultural biofortification, supplementation, rather than looking at holistic solutions like nutritious foods produced by sustainable systems? An example is the Micronutrient Forum that includes food-based solutions as a sort of afterthought.
Oh, so it's about food fortification. I mean, I've always thought that that's one instrument, one policy that's important for potentially raising the floor, especially clearly with regard to certain micronutrients, vitamins, minerals, which are deficiencies are highly prevalent in wherever those foods are being consumed. So yeah, I mean that has a role. It should never be an either or. I don't think I've never quite understood why there's been that why it's been framed in that way, actually, a lot of the time. So I think, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think that reductionist science that we see nutrition through nutrients so much, and that's challenging for citizens to comprehend, I think, in some
yeah,
respects where we eat foods. And so people relate more to whole
yeah,
foods in addition to sort of the fortification element.
yeah. So yeah, you're right, Christina. So there is another part of that, which I think we do need to push back against nutritionism. Um, Georgie Scrins first defined that term, whereby we see solutions always about tinkering with nutrient levels and composition, when foods and diet are quite different to just nutrients. And I think we need to get back to remembering what foods are and the culture of eating. Actually, there's a whole other area around this, the sociability and the commensality of and the culture of food that is going to be. I think we need to refine that, find ways of moving back to that. And I know there are challenges around the idea no one will ever cook again because it takes too long, and that's always going to be. It's about redefining, the way we want to live, and to what extent is it important to have a sociability and a culture around food. And there's a lot of sort of societal level conversations I think are needed at the moment with regard to food.
Yeah, and anyone who came to our symposium last month will know that we're very interested in boosting, capacity of chefs and the numbers of chefs that
Yeah,
cook fresh whole
right,
foods and can make them convenient and readily available for people. Yeah, and in the Brazilian dietary guidelines on the front cover are 5 or 6 different tablecloths which represent that social
right.
consumption of food. Like, yeah, I completely agree. And
So yeah, you're absolutely right. Just one other thought. My partner works in a food bank, and that became a food club, and it became a place where people cooked, and people sat around the table and started to talk to each other. They hadn't talked to each other in the neighborhood, and it's extraordinary that sort of transformation you can see just locally. Mm.
absolutely. And then some of the food policy solutions, it's one of the questions about the welfare solutions, but also our workplace. In France, they have a dedicated lunchtime that you have to take that forces you
Right.
to sit
Yeah.
down and be
Yeah.
social with people, where most of us eat at our desks.
I heard about that. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So Doug Schrock has a great question. Can you say more about how globalization has played a role in the problems, but even more importantly, how it could play a role in the solutions?
Globalization. Well, I mean, in many ways, it take a long time to really answer that because it manifests in so many different ways. But I think one of the important parts of globalization is sharing experience and capacity and knowledge across uh, both with regard to government sharing, uh, media, um, the benefits of working together, connectivity. Um, we're also facing a whole set of challenges around populism, and we see what's happening in the US. which are threatening that kind of solidarity or international or multilateral engagement. And I think that is a big. But I think. But that's a big part of the challenge. There's a big role for the UN, which I haven't really talked about. In terms of supranational um, engagement around this, setting norms and guidelines and helping countries to undertake these actions and governments to undertake these actions. That but they're running into trouble with they're not being funded very well. So that I think there's a whole from right to household level right up to a global, there are sets of institutions that can be potentially revitalized towards this transformation. And they'll need to be, and I think we, for example, UNICEF have recently, well, a couple of years ago, I think, made it very clear that they won't be working with, and they won't be taking funding from ultra-processed food industry. Nutrition International also have guidelines along those lines, very strong, very clear, transparent. And I think that's an important step forward.
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, globalization is it's about using that connectivity for the social good, really.
Yeah. Thank you. I don't normally do this, but Doug Schrock has a follow-up question, which I'd quite like to ask. He says, as someone who's spoken out and written critically about the food system for many years and the big players, have you faced backlash and how have you dealt with it?
Oh, backlash. Yeah, yes. I, and I won't go into all the details of what that is. You get attacked on social media. I actually wasn't on social media until a few years ago, but you get various attacks, but then you actually just have to leave Twitter because that's that's the worst place. Um, um, but you just have to stand your ground, and if you believe in it, and if you have knowledge and evidence that certain things are happening, you shouldn't hide away from it. I also recognize, and this is nothing. What I've experienced is nothing compared to some of the things that I've heard of. Yesterday, I heard from Vanessa Nakate in Uganda and the way she was multiple death threats her and her family had experienced, along with Greta Thunberg, with the climate activism. And I know this has happened across the world with regard to food activism. But yeah, you have to, you have to choose how you operate. But I don't think you should be cowed by this. It may be easier said than done, but I personally haven't had so far too many problems with regard to that. And actually, I think there's really unwritten sort of whether it's a paper or I don't know a monograph or on activism in this space and the learnings that we can have across different disciplines from climate to health to food. Um, yeah, so because
Yeah, those kind
it
of
is,
advocacy policy coalitions where we join
yeah,
alliances and we're stronger in our voice.
yeah, yeah. So that's partial
Yeah,
answer.
excellent. Thank you. We're just going to have two more questions. So an anonymous attendee says, what are your hopes for the new UK food strategy?
Oh, well, yeah, good question. I must admit that I was a bit disappointed when I saw the way well, first of all, I didn't know how decisions were made on the selection of members for the advisory board. And then I saw that there were several industry members there, and I didn't understand why that is the case. Many other people didn't understand why that is the case. There's some great people on the board. So, again, why aren't a clear set of guidelines and with regards to conflict of interest that are clearly followed and a clear process of the governance of the should have been clear and simple, made, that it's putting people and planet first, wasn't there. So that wasn't a great move at the beginning. I'm slightly concerned about the delays as well
Mm.
and different, but ultimately, I think government is taking heed of the fact that the public mood has changed, I think, in the last 5 or 6 years, and there is much more of a strong demand and motivation and energy towards a serious sort of overhaul of our food system, and I hope that finds route in this food strategy. And a lot of great stuff was in the original. I mean, the 2021 Henry Dimbleby's work,
Yeah.
which can be, drawn on and updated. But yeah, so I would say I'm hopeful. And I hope there's another thing about hope. I don't like optimism. I prefer hope. Hope is it's more of a springboard to action, if you like. It has agency built into it. And so I will always say I'm more hopeful because if we think of it in those terms, we can drive change as well as just waiting for it.
Yeah. Right. So Deviana Dewey says, fantastic talk, Stuart. I have a question on the distract point that you brought up. It's clear to see how some multinationals have done harm to our health and our food system using this approach. Do you think that there can be a middle ground where they can still participate to some extent at global conferences or workshops on health and food systems? Or do you think that their participation, including sponsorship, should be entirely avoided?
I think we have to find ways, and again, I think conferences are beginning to do this, find ways of differentiating corporations that are genuinely trying to change and to change, for example, the percentage of their portfolio which is on healthier foods from those who aren't. And until I'm not one of these people who thinks we'll bring them all around the table and they'll start doing good things. No, I think it should be the other way around. I think we need to see the change first, and then those discussions can happen whether they can be part of the discussions on policy. I never understand why we need food industry in discussions of policy. On implementation, yes, but why on policy? So, and especially with the track record that we've had. So I think it's about developing clear guidelines in terms of engagement with private sector for whatever purpose, whether it's funding, whether it's talking on a platform in a conference, and being clear about that. We did that. I actually was involved in the process to do that with IFPRI, my former organization, about 8 years ago. And it can be done, and it should be done, and we just need clarity, and it needs to be on a website, publicly available, so everyone sees
Disclosed.
it. Everyone knows what we're talking about.
Yeah, brilliant. Very last question. It's a bit of a combination of Shiona Foley and mine. So Shiona says, with your idea of reclaiming freedom, could you comment a bit more on that in relation to the idea of free trade, liberal dominating ownership of that concept, and how what the alternative might be in terms of freedom? And linked to that is my sort of build the citizen voice. You talked about we need to build the citizen voice because government and business do respond to that. And is that real? Like, how do we do that in the face of the massive appeal through food marketing that industry creates?
Yeah. Oh, wow. They keep coming. These freedom.
Last one.
The three there, actually, Christine. But no, freedom. I mean, I used to get so really fed up with the way that this word was misused, and it usually was ending up being spoken of by someone who had the ability, the finance, the power to be able to do what he or she wanted to do, or an organization to do what he wanted to do, when we should be thinking of those least capable. And often, so if it's about freedom to buy whatever I want, whenever I want, I think the freedom is really about access and affordability of a healthy diet. It's not about, and those who are the poorest households aren't in that position. So it's about reclaiming that and reclaiming it away from the libertarian sort of stance of nanny state, don't touch, don't regulate. And also there's a freedom of speaking truth to power, which again links to the citizens and citizen voice, and we should use it. We have it actually here in the UK. I think we have a media that's controlled, but there's. I've forgotten the last part of your question there. What?
Just the appeal. That element of appeal that industry are really throwing at us, and getting that citizen voice out. And of course, there are some examples of that happening in the UK currently with buyback and the food farming and Countryside Commission food
Yeah,
compensation. But just any sort of other thoughts that you had on that?
yeah, I think the visibility of some of the campaigns are maybe it's just I'm looking for them more. I think they're more visible and they're having more of an impact. Um, and I think government is taking notice of them. And I actually really have such, again, hope with regard to change when I see younger people involved, youth movements. Um, that's just so powerful. And again, yesterday I think I was way over the average age in this meeting, but that's fine. So I think that's where change has to happen. And again, talking about age, whoever we are, have to be talking about children further, and even, as I say, unborn children. We have to take an intergenerational approach to all this, and think about the world in 2050 and beyond, as part of this.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Stuart. We're going to
Thank
take
you.
hope with us, that we have hope for change, for transformation. Thank you so much for such an insightful presentation and discussion. Thank you, everyone, for your questions. I'm sorry I didn't get through them all today. I really did try. Yeah, please do join us next Wednesday at 9:15 in the morning, so a slightly different time of day, for Professor Greta De Feo, who's going to talk to us about the school breakfast policy in the UK. So thank you again, Stuart, and thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Have a good evening.
Bye.